Hey everybody in YouTube land. My name is Dustin and I've been a skateboarder for 35 years and counting. And I'm going to show you some of the skateboards I've owned over the years. I didn't include all of them. Some of them I couldn't find online and some of them I just couldn't remember. But each one of the ones I'm going to show you has a story behind it. And hopefully you'll enjoy it. Just check it out. So this is the very first board I ever owned. It was a Variflex banana board that my parents bought for me at KB Toys in Winchester, Virginia at the Apple Blossom Mall. We were at the toy store. My go-to thing to get whenever I was allowed to get a toy was usually an action figure, but for some reason I wandered over to the sports equipment section and saw these yellow skateboards. They looked cool to me and I said, hey, how about this? And they said, sure. They seemed a little bit surprised, but nonetheless, they supported it and I got this board. And I learned how to ride it by just going down the sidewalk in front of our house. And it's just this kind of curvy strip of concrete that went at a slight down angle. And I would just try to stand up and ride down the sidewalk and then go back up and do it again, and go back up and do it again. I didn't really understand how to turn or how to do anything other than ride, but that was my very first board. This is one of the first like real looking skateboards that I had that was contemporary for the time. I believe my dad got this at a yard sale or a swap meet or something like that. A Bruce Lee board. Pretty sure it was generic. And the one that I had was actually light blue. But I rode that around and I felt the difference because by this time I had seen other professional looking skateboards and maybe from commercials or movies. I kind of understood that the one that I had was not contemporary or cool. So I was stoked to get a board that looked more like a quote unquote real skateboard. This was my first really official professional board, Per Welinder street model with this same colorway. My dad assembled it for me and put clear grip tape strips on the top, which looked really cool. I don't remember the trucks and wheels, but I rode this thing for a couple of years, and it was, a very important board because it was my first proper setup. I didn't know who Per Welinder was, Per, I should say, and but I was beginning to learn about skateboard companies, so I knew that this was a Powell Peralta. And at the time, you could rent videos from the rental stores that included the Bones Brigade video show, Future Primitive, maybe Wheels of Fire. I'm not sure, but there were definitely at least like 4 or 5 different skate videos that you could rent. So around this time is when I started to, for the first time, see professional skateboarding, what that looked like on half pipes and in the streets. And at this time, freestyle and street skating was just starting, and vert half pipe skating was sort of the most known, popular one. So this is a 1989 Ray Barbee board, one of my favorite boards of all time. As you can see, it has a big nose, which was a big deal at the time. Board shapes were changing pretty drastically. Noses were getting bigger. Street skating was starting to develop more, and I was by this time I was already familiar with Bones Brigade and people like Lance Mountain and Mike McGill, Rodney Mullen, Tony Hawk, Tommy Guerrero, and of course Ray Barbee. So I'd probably seen Band Miss. I knew who Ray Barbee was, and he was instantly one of my favorites. Just like a really smooth style, very relatable, and probably the first African American skater that I had ever seen, which I thought was awesome. Yeah, I rode this board for a really long time. I learned how to ollie properly on this board and started to mess around with some of my earliest tricks, which were probably like shove-its. This is my first popsicle shaped board. So by 92, boards were basically this sort of football shape. And this was a board on which I would be able to do kickflips, rolling kickflips, which was a big deal. I actually landed my very first kickflip on a friend's board. My friend Jed Ross had a Planet Earth board. I'm not sure what make or pro model it was, but I did a stationary kickflip on his board. And then when I got this board, I started practicing them more and more. And this marked a really big transition in skating. The big pants, small wheels era was in full effect. And I really like this board, a very unique graphic. And you don't see too many of these out in the collector's realm on the internet these days. Lance Conklin, I didn't really know who he was. I grew to appreciate him more later. But he rode for Powell, and Powell was my favorite company still at this time, so I was stoked on this board. 93, so by now I was pretty aware that like newer independent companies were coming out and board graphics were changing a lot. It was getting away from pro graphics, and just even the pro graphics were using pretty random stuff instead of the iconic graphics of the 80s. And so this was an Acme team deck. I think it's called the Gunfire deck. My dad got this for me. It was a great board. I remember he did a little Charlie Brown zigzag on the grip tape, which was very appropriate for the time because like 8th Street, Dan Paterka, I think, had that graphic. And I loved this board. I continued to try different tricks on it, kick flips, heel flips, things like that. Just fundamentals of flat ground skating. I didn't have a lot of experience on obstacles at this point, so I'd never really skated ledges or rails or anything, maybe just up and down curbs, little ollies and stuff like that. And I was beginning to like understand that the skater identity was very different than it was in the 80s. It was more of a outcast thing because what we were wearing were huge baggy pants, lots of bright, loud colors. People were dyeing their hair, wearing chain wallets, cutting off their pants at the bottom. I mean, we looked pretty wild for the time, but I loved it. And it was like such a special feeling to be part of that culture. So let's see, this was the 1994 Channel 1 team deck. And I remember I basically ruined my Acme board on purpose. I took it out to our like shed and like started like bashing it with a hammer or like chopping it with a hatchet to try to make it look like I'd worn it down, which it was very obvious that I was just destroying it. But that was my reasoning, that if it looked worn down enough that my dad would buy me a new board. And I remember showing him the Acme and he was like, what happened to this? But eventually I got this board, Channel 1 team deck. So my parents were getting divorced, I think around this time. And I remember riding this board in Winchester, Virginia for the first time, which is a small city, but it was much more happening than where I grew up in Stephen City, Virginia, which is the county. And I, could kickflip and do different tricks on this board. And I met up with that guy, Jed Ross, who I mentioned earlier. And he and I were like two of the only guys our age who could do those tricks. And so once we connected, it was pretty cool. And then I was going to be moving to Winchester. So I was looking forward to skating with him and a bunch of other kids my own age. So that, was a pretty big milestone. Okay, so this board, this is a new school board. I never knew who Bobby Kuhns was. I couldn't pick him out. I don't know, think I watched any of his video parts or even saw a photo of him in a magazine. I just bought this board based on the graphic and didn't last very long. So Jed Ross, his house was a spot. He had this really nice house with a great driveway with this like sort of built-in cul-de-sac that was part of his property, and everybody would skate there. And he had ledges and waxed like concrete curbs that he found somewhere and all these obstacles. So we would session his house. And one time I went over there with this brand new board and there was a huge session and everybody was going in to like get a drink or something. So I leaned my board up against his house and unbeknownst to me, one of the older skater dudes who was kind of intimidating, this guy named Alan, he focused my board. He just put it on the ground and said, whose board is this? Probably some poser. And he stomped it and broke it. And everybody like just froze and didn't do anything. And I came back out and didn't know what had happened. So I stepped on my board and felt it sagging. And I was like, oh man, like what happened here? And I looked and my board was broken. I was like, shit. Like I just assumed that it was like a crappy board. Nobody told me that Alan had focused my board until way later. And when I found out, I was like super bummed. I was like, oh man, like that sucks. Like, because it was not easy for me to get boards back then. So I don't know how long I had to wait to replace this one. I probably had to skate some haggard hand-me-down boards, but yeah, this board didn't get to, live up to its potential. This is a board I got for Christmas, 1994 ATM Click. The one I had was a white background with green text or logo, and I skated this board quite a bit. However, by this time, I remember I hadn't been skating as much, and so a lot of the kids in the area who were skating all the time were starting to progress a lot faster than me. And by the time I kind of rejoined the skate crew or the skate scene in my town, I had gone from having like a good reputation of being able to do kick flips and heel flips and being, considered good. And then everybody else like caught up to me pretty quickly. And so I was starting to fall behind, and then people were kind of vibing me and like, I think probably I was bragging too much or had too much of an ego back then. So I remember being put in my place by my peers at this time. And then another thing that's interesting about this board is the summer after I got this board, I quit and I gave the board away to a girl who was like older than me. She was the friend of another girl who I was like in love with, my friend's older sister. And I don't know why I thought it was a good idea. I gave her a bunch of pants and shirts, like everything skate related that I own. I just was like, here, take it. And then she left and went back to wherever she was from. I think she lived out of state, like North Carolina or something. And I never saw that board again. Also, I remember getting this for Christmas, and it was hidden under my parents' bed. This was when I was living with my stepdad and mom, and I used to go in there when no one was around and like look at it under the bed, and I knew it was there, so I had to act like I was surprised on Christmas Day when I opened it. Okay, so here's a pretty big milestone: 95 World Industries Team Deck. Uh, by this time, I'm probably reading magazines more, watching more videos, more aware of pros, and I think by this time I'd probably seen Trilogy, or maybe not, but Trilogy was about to come out. I was aware that World Industries was like the company, and anything related to World, Blind 101, Plan B, all that stuff, I was like super into. But then I got this board for whatever reason, and this was kind of like the beginning of the lame era of World Industries, where they started using Devilman and Wet Willie, which made them a ton of money. But my friends made fun of me for having this board, and I was working on 360 flips a lot, I remember, and I couldn't quite do them. I could like flip them 270, and I skated slow. I was still trying to get caught up to a lot of my friends who were way better than me at this point. And yeah, so I rode this board, and I remember this one lasting a pretty long time, and I kind of rode it till its natural end of its lifespan and moved on. This was, I think, the board that I had right after the World Board of Blind 1995 Team Deck, random graphic. I don't think I've seen it too many times other than this. And at this time, I was skating with kind of a new group of friends, my friend Christian and his buddies, and I was starting to pull away from like the hometown crew. Like this group of friends that I had, they all lived out in sticks, and so we get together and skate. And I was trying to kind of work on my skills, get back up to a level where I felt I could show my face in Winchester. But we had some fun. This board ended up breaking, and I'm not sure if I broke it or what happened, but it ended up getting a big crack, and I think I just focused it and was like over it. But it was a cool board. I cut the grip tape on the top graphic so that it was you could see the Blind logo on the top graphic, so that was notable. Okay, so this is a hookups board. The one I had a light green, I think like full dip background. You couldn't see wood grain, so it wasn't a stained board. And apparently this is the 94 graphic, but I got it in 95. And this is after breaking that Blind board. And I went to the bike shop, which had a small skate shop section in it. And I had barely enough money to get it. I paid in cash, and I remember being a little bit short. And that girl who I was in love with, my friend's older sister, gave me like 80 cents or whatever I needed to kind of complete the purchase. And I think they even gave it to me for like not the full price because they just felt sorry for me because I was so desperate to get a board. And I rode this board. And I remember we were beginning to skate downtown Winchester, Virginia at this time, for which we would get in a lot of trouble, mostly over the years. But it was a cool board. I liked Jeremy Klein. I didn't realize this was actually a recycled graphic from his World Industries days, but I was starting to become more aware of like anime and stuff, so I was into it. Okay, so 96, Fabian Alomar. I didn't really know who he was, but I loved Menace, and that's why I got this board. After seeing the trilogy video, that was like my favorite video at the time, and I love Blind World, 101, Menace, and eventually I would learn a lot more about Fabian Alomar, and I respected his skating a lot, and the person that he is. It's really unique guy. But this board was just a random board that I had. It was like a comic book series they did. I had a yellow background on mine, and this is right when I got my very first video camera. So my friend Brantley and I were starting to begin filming each other skating, and I remember at this point starting to feel a little more comfortable on my board, filming flat ground lines and stuff. But I think I was still socially pretty low on the totem pole. And when I would show my face, out in Winchester, like I got the sense that I wasn't fully accepted yet, but it was getting there. And the Fabian Alomar board was cool. I remember lying on my back in my room in Winchester and putting the board on my feet and imagining myself doing tricks over the Bay blocks in San Francisco, and emulating like stuff that I saw in the magazines. I think there was one with either Javier Nunez or somebody doing a switch frontside flip over the Bay blocks. And I was just like, so obsessed with it. Okay, here's an important board. Ronnie Creager, 1996. He was one of my favorite skaters, still is. After seeing Trilogy and 20 Shot Sequence, he just was incredibly amazing to watch. And his board shape was like one of the best shapes I've ever ridden. And this was at a time when I was starting to get a lot more consistent with my tricks, and I locked in 360 flips when I had this board, and I felt pretty good, pretty confident on my board. I started dressing differently too. I was kind of getting into a more hip hop style of skating. I was starting to wear basketball jerseys and really baggy, like blind jeans and stuff, and skating banks and flat ground a lot and manual pads, and still wasn't doing too many grinds or slides at this point. But I was stoked to be skating this board. But unfortunately, an incident happened where we were out skating in Winchester, and these redneck guys drove by and yelled at us, and that happened all the time. But my friend Christian, who I was with at the time, decided to yell back at them. So they, pulled a U-turn and came back, and basically they were going to beat us up. And they pulled a knife on us and ended up taking our boards, driving off with them. It was super sketchy and scary. And then it became this whole ordeal where, like, to get our boards back, we had to call the police, and they filed a report, and we had to go to court, and our parents were freaking out over it and stuff. And when we got the boards back, they were all muddy, and like dudes had like tried riding them, and it looked like they had actually ridden in mud. Like the bearings are all caked with dirt, and the grip was gone on the board, and the pop was gone. It just sucked. It was like ruined. And I remember being really pissed at my friend for that, but it was, just stupidity on everybody's part. And yeah, I missed that board a lot. It had the best shape. It was like a flat concave, and it flipped perfectly. It was really light. It was pretty skinny too. I think it was like 7.4, something like that. All right, here's a Gino Iannucci, 96. This is right when he got on Chocolate, and the Mouse video had come out. It was probably replaced Trilogy as being my favorite video of all time. And it was a cool board. I didn't realize this was a parody of a Keenan Milton board. I think a Blind that had come out a few years back, like an orphanage theme. And the thing I remember about skating this board is it was a small board. It was skinny. And I had these big wheels on it for some reason, like over 55 millimeters. And it just kind of didn't fit the shape of the board, but I just made it work anyway. I don't know why I didn't try to switch out smaller wheels, but you just don't think of those details when you're a teenager, I guess. And I remember filming more with Brantley and getting lines at our local spot, Daniel Morgan Middle School and Montgomery Ward Plaza in Winchester. So it was a good board. Okay, so this is a really blurry picture, but it's the best I could find. This is a Toy Machine 1997 team deck. I was hanging around with these guys, James and Eric. They showed me the Toy Machine Welcome to Hell video, I think a year before this, and it kind of changed my whole thoughts on street skating, and I started to like appreciate other styles of street skating more, because for a long time it was just World, Girl, and Chocolate. That's all I really cared about. But then I started to realize like, oh, Toy Machine's awesome, and like Zero and all these companies were starting to come out. So the Tom Yeto brand or umbrella of companies I started to get really into. One notable thing about this board is I was featured in the local Winchester Star doing a kickflip off this like kicker ramp that we made in a church parking lot for this article on skateboarding that they did. A local reporter came out and interviewed us and took a photo. So that was pretty cool. It was a good board, good shape too. I was riding Jamie Thomas America shoes when that photo was shot. Okay, this is a Zoo York team deck, another grainy photo, but that was their classic tag logo that they had at the time. And I remember this board being kind of a shock to me because the concave was really deep and it had like a big, like wide nose, and the shape is just gnarly, but it suited the East Coast style at the time. I mean, people riding bigger boards, bigger wheels, doing wall rides, pole jams, and stuff like that. And so I kind of embraced it. But the New York scene also had its own share of like technical street skaters and stylish like hip hop street skaters. So that's what I was into. So I remember learning Ollie late shove it's on this board, which I probably saw Jamie Thomas and some other dudes doing those, and maybe some East Coast guys too. Eastern Exposure, Underachievers had come out, and that was one of my favorite videos at this time. And I really loved this board. I remember just riding around on it, like hooded sweatshirt, baggy jeans, riding this board down the street, and it felt so cool. Okay, this is an interesting board. This is a Rodney Mullen 97, I believe, and this was a hand-me-down from my friend Chris Camden, who worked at a skate shop in Baltimore, and it was in basically brand new condition when he gave it to me. I always liked Rodney Mullen, so I rode it. It had a cool shape, kind of almost reminded me of that Ronnie Creager shape, and yeah, I just rode it around Winchester at this tiny church parking lot where we set up obstacles, and I rode that board there a lot. And yeah, it's notable. It's the only Rodney Mullen board I've ever had. Okay, by this era, we had moved our operations to an elementary school up the street. It had super rough ground, like gravelly ground. And I think I was the one who suggested putting like a box or something there to skate, because I knew that we would never, no one would hassle us there. That was one of the big problems we had for a while, was just getting in trouble skating in downtown Winchester and skating at all the schools and local spots that we love. So I was just looking for something out of the way. And I remember riding this board. I did one of the best 360 flips of my life on this board, just on flat ground. And I was with this skater named Romeo. He was notably one of the first African American skater kids in our crew, because a lot of the African American kids in our community looked down on skating like it wasn't cool at all. So he was with me that day, and I just remember going fast and doing a 360 flip and just boom, landing it like bolts, and like he was like, "Whoa!" And I couldn't believe that I did it. And so I'm glad somebody saw it. And yeah, Jason Dill, I just was a fan because of Trilogy. And then this was a company called 23 that he was on with Sal Barbier's company. Yeah, kind of a cheesy looking graphic now that I look at it, but whatever. It's cool at the time. All right, getting back to the East Coast roots. Capital was a company that we all liked back then. It was a DC company. And since we were close enough to DC, they were like local heroes to us. Sergei Trudnowski also I had seen in the Sub-Zero video, so I was a big fan of the Philly scene. And Silver Star was a company that kind of combines DC skaters and Philly skaters. And so I got this board. It had a nice shape, nice kind of skinny shape. I guess the artwork was probably done by his daughter or something. And yeah, rode this thing, man. Took it. I think I took this one to Woodward maybe for the first time, because I got to go as a camper, and yeah, I enjoyed skating this board. Okay, Maple 1998 team deck. I think this is around like the Black Cat era, maybe a little bit before. Jerry Sue was on Maple, and I was a big fan of his. And by this time we were 411 video magazine junkies. We watched every episode. And I got interested in Maple a little bit more just because of Mark Johnson and Jerry Sue and the Donger, and John the Man Reeves, I think, was on. And yeah, so anyway, I skated this board, and the notable story is we took a bus from Winchester, Virginia, down to Charleston, South Carolina, to skate with my buddy Taylor, who had moved there. And we met local ripper Jack Saback in Charleston, and he went on to get pretty well known in skating and get sponsored and be in videos and magazines and stuff. But at the time, he was just a local dude, and he was showing us around, showing us spots, and we skated all over the place, man. Skated all these different spots. I remember a lot of the places we skated had like sandy ground, and kind of got grit in your bearings and stuff. But it was cool. It was a cool trip. That bus ride was like a crazy experience for us. It was super long, and we were exposed to like a lot of people who were from other walks of life. People begging for food and money on the bus, and people like smelled bad. Like people look homeless, and we're just like, whoa. But our parents let us go on this trip, and yeah, that's what I remember most about that board. Let's see here. Okay, so this board, this is kind of a weird story. I liked Acme as a company up until probably the mid 90s, and then they just started doing weirder graphics. They did a lot of collabs with comic book companies, and this was just some random board. The way I ended up getting it is on their website, and this is like early internet days. They held a contest where they invited people to write in and give examples of other skateboard companies who had ripped off logos or graphics or concepts directly and used them as board graphics. And that was a big thing in the 90s. Like people would just take existing logos or existing characters and just run them as graphics. And so I guess they were making some kind of political point, but they, advertised it as a contest where you could win product or something. So I was interested more in that. And I remember emailing my submission where I just like listed a bunch of companies and board graphics where they ripped something off and like kind of gave the evidence, like here's the original character and now it appears on this board. And I ended up winning a board. It just showed up in my house randomly one day in a box with no note or anything, just a board box with one single deck in it, and it was a slick bottom. And in 1998 nobody was riding slick bottoms, but I was like stoked. I got a free board, and I went back on the website, and sure enough, they listed my name as one of the winners of the contest. And I rode that board. I don't think I rode it for too long. I remember it was really poppy. It had a lot of snap to it, but it just felt really stiff, and I couldn't get comfortable on it. It was skinny, but it had concave too, which felt weird. But yeah, it's a memorable board because I got it for free. Okay, so you might notice we're jumping from 1998 to 2002. So I graduated high school in 99, and there were a couple boards that I couldn't find that I had at the end of my high school days. But going into college, I was riding a lot of local company boards, like shop boards and blanks and just random stuff, or hand-me-down boards, because I was going through boards like monthly. And so I could just, whatever I could get my hands on, I would ride. But this is a board that I bought while I was in college at Planet Earth, Kenny Anderson, and it was a great board. Notable story on this board, I kickflipped the White Steps in DC. It's a famous spot. And I backside 180 it first try, and I was super stoked. It was a great session. I had brand new shoes on. I was riding some DC shoes. They were actually too small for my feet, but it was a really skinny board, but it just felt good under my feet. I had good sessions on this board with my crew, George Mason University skaters. So definitely remember that one. Okay, so we're skipping ahead even further. Throughout most of my college years, I was riding shop boards and blanks. And I actually rode for the East Coast shop, and they had this sort of brand called Seven, which I think had some kind of Christian origins, which I wasn't into, but I was into getting free stuff. And I worked for the shop. I think I burned my bridges there because I quit without giving notice so that I could hang out with my girlfriend on her birthday, which is a perfectly stupid thing to do. And then, yeah, that was it. But during my college years, I basically just rode random boards, whatever I could get, mostly local boards. This is when I moved to California from Virginia, which was a huge move in my life. My girlfriend is now my wife and mother of my son. I moved out to Menlo Park with her, and there's a skate park right by Stanford, and I rode this board there. This is when I was kind of having like an identity crisis, and I'd injured my ankle at the end of college to the point where I couldn't really skate street anymore. So I was still wanted to skate all the time, but I couldn't do a lot of the same tricks that I used to do. So I was like, all right, well, I'm just going to switch up my shape. If I'm going to be skating in skate parks, I'll get a bigger, wider board. So this board had like a longer wheelbase, and it was like 9 by 33. and I rode this thing. And I remember Cairo Foster came to that park, the Burgess Park in Menlo Park, and I got to see just the tail end of his session there. He was there with the filmer, and I did like a board slide on the ledge and popped out in the middle with like the wheel slide, and I think somebody like clapped for me, and I was stoked. But I rode that board for a while. I went, further down the rabbit hole, weird shapes and old school shapes, and I got this board. This board, I had the Indy 215s on, the longest trucks that were available at the time, 10-inch axles, and it was really weird to get used to that board, but it was fun. I couldn't do street tricks on it, but I didn't care. I was just carving and doing like slasher grinds in the bowl, and I was getting more comfortable skating bowls and transitions at this time. So it was a fun board. The first time I went to the Sunnyvale skate park was with this board. And then I switched back to a popsicle shape, wanted to get back into street. And this is around the time we moved to San Francisco, if I remember correctly. I remember this board, I really liked the shape and I liked the colors, but I felt a little weird about skating a board that had like kind of objectification of women, and like a butt was the prominent graphic. So I just board slid it a bunch, and it kind of went away. You couldn't really tell, but yeah, it's also my first Antihero board, which was notable. Okay, now by then we'd moved to San Francisco. I bought this particular board at FTC Western Edition. Brad Johnson was part of a Miles Davis series. That company always had rad series boards. And I skated this board a lot at this place called The Island, which was right across from the Embarcadero. And it was basically a flat ground spot. There were ledges and stuff there, but everybody just gathered and skated flat ground. And it was within skating distance from where we lived. We lived at First and Folsom in San Francisco. I remember riding the bus from FTC back to our apartment, and someone on the bus who didn't skate, this guy was like, "Hey, that's a nice board." And I was stoked. I also remember playing a game of skate with this random out-of-town guy at the Island on this board, and I landed like all these tricks that I normally wouldn't ever land. And then it was also the same day as the death of Michael Jackson. And so randomly, while we're in the middle of playing this game of skate, this whole like flash mob of people appeared on the island, and they had a boombox and they were playing Michael Jackson music, and everybody just had this impromptu dance party right there to celebrate the life of Michael Jackson. And this is, of course, before a lot of the allegations of like child abuse and stuff. So everybody was kind of shocked by his death and wanted to remember him. So that's what I remember most about that board. Okay, so by now we're moved back to my wife's parents' house in Foster City. And this board marked me kind of returning to wanting to skate shaped boards. And the shape that you see here is actually different than the one that I rode, because this company, Welcome, they would print the same graphics on different shapes. The one I rode was more like that Ray Barbee board from my youth, wider with a smaller nose and square tail. But I love this board. And what's notable about this board is I took a trip to Virginia, which was rare by now. And I spent 4 weeks there, brought this board, and I was with my dad for a week. And he took me to a skate park in Front Royal, Virginia, where they had this great skate park. I'm sure it's still there. It's the first time I got to ride it. And it was incredible because growing up in Winchester, Virginia, there was no skate park. Front Royal was 10 miles away, and they were a smaller town, and they somehow managed to build this great concrete park. And my dad took me there every day the week that I was staying there. And I loved riding it. I met some of the locals and felt really good. I felt really good on this board. It was also the last time I saw my dad, because he died about 10 years later, but I hadn't gone back to Virginia, and he never came out to visit in California. So that was the last, sessions that I had on this board were with my dad. Okay, so my son was born in 2016, and I had this board. I think I just got it because I was like, I need a new board to deal with being a new parent. And I remember riding it, and I hadn't skated for a while because I was doing dad stuff and staying up all night. And my legs felt so weak. And I remember trying to ollie up the ledge at the skate park. I couldn't even make it up. And I was really skinny. And my friend who I met at the park, Dave Rosenberg, tilt mode army guy, who is also a teacher, he was like making fun of me, but it was a cool board. Bluetown. I for some reason want to say Jesse Hotchkiss had something to do with this company, but I'm not 100% sure. But I loved the graphic because by now I was really into music, playing guitar. And yeah, I don't recall riding this board for very long. I might have given it away. Something I haven't mentioned is that throughout my time in California, I've been known to give away a lot of boards to students since I was a school teacher and just random people. And sometimes I've had these weird like freakouts where I'll just throw the board in the dumpster and decide that I'm quitting, and then a week later go out and buy a new complete. I've kind of calmed down from doing that kind of thing, but every once in a while it still happens. And here's my son, 2018, and I'm guessing he's 2 years old in this picture. And that's a Krooked board that I bought from a van store in Burlingame. I remember the guy at the shop, offered to put on the grip tape, and put it on like weird and crooked, no pun intended. And there was like air bubbles in it, and it looked like shit. And I was like, man, you work at a shop, you don't even know how to grip a board. But it was a van shop, so this guy, I don't even know if he skated. But I remember just being like, it's cool, man, whatever. And then I just took the board and skated it. And this had it was like 9x33, almost similar to that hot rod board because it had a longer wheelbase. And I liked riding this board, but eventually I realized that I don't like long wheelbases. I prefer short wheelbases. So that was that. Okay, now speaking of short wheelbases, even though Lucero in an interview said he prefers long wheelbases, this board I think was a Schmidt Sticks reissue Lucero, and you can see it's got the little black label elephant on it. And at this point, I'm riding the board and not really doing tricks, not ever really popping my tail, just carving, going to skate parks, and having a great time. Although I hurt myself twice in this era. Once was I came down too hard, dropping off of like a little launch ramp that someone had brought. A kid brought this launch ramp to the local skate park, and I launched it and came down really hard, and I ended up tearing a muscle and getting a blood clot in my calf, and that really sucked. I had to go on blood thinners, and it was gnarly. And then I also on this board hit a rock flying at this big brick bank at our local park, and I slammed and like tweaked my back and like knocked the wind out of me and like sprained my elbow. So there were two pretty severe injuries on this board. I haven't gotten into all the other injuries from the past, but I'm just gonna move on because there's too many to really talk about. Okay, here's 2020 Krooked Gonz board. This is like around the time of the pandemic, so I'm mainly just skating in front of the house, just kind of cruising, going to the skate park occasionally with my mask. This is another board that I bought at Atlas, and Mike Manitas set it up for me. And I remember him commenting that it was like an East Coast board because I got bigger wheels. And it's kind of a wider board. And I like this setup well enough, but was starting to kind of lose interest in skating a little bit at this time. But then something very strange happened. Over the pandemic, I started to watch YouTube a lot and got interested in freestyle skating. Mike Osterman from Waltz had all these videos with like explaining tricks and giving trick tips. And then there was this 80s freestyle channel, which had all this contest footage of freestylers. And I was just, for some reason, really drawn to it. And eventually I went for it and bought a freestyle board. And this was the first one I got, which is a Per Welinder, which takes me back to like my very first, pro board in 87. Except this one was way different, super flat, super skinny, and completely foreign to me. So learning how to skate freestyle at age 41 was pretty crazy and weird. But it also reinvigorated my love for skating, and I got to like learn all kinds of new things, all kinds of new tricks and pros and history of skating that I just wasn't aware of before. And then I became obsessed. So here, in the next slide, you'll see Freestyle Mania. So I had all these boards, 2022. You can see I still had a cruiser park board. That one with the cat, that's a Donovan Rice ATM board that I was sort of fawning over on the internet for a long time. And I finally bought it. I ended up giving it to a student, but all the other boards that are pictured here are freestyle boards. Mode is a company who I, really have developed a lot of respect for and Terry Sennett, somebody who's really cool in the freestyle scene, corresponds with me whenever I reach out. I also got obsessed with Kevin Harris as a skater. He's one of the smoothest and best freestylers in my opinion. As Jean-Marc also had kind of a similar shape, and so those were tiny boards. And I, for a while, convinced myself that I needed to have the smallest possible freestyle board in order to feel happy. But it turned out that that's not really the best board for my body type, because I'm 6 feet 1 inch tall and the wheelbase is just too short. But I learned a lot of freestyle tricks on these boards, and I skated every day that I could and learned as many tricks as possible, which brings us to today. I'm currently riding this Waltz setup that I got directly from Mike Osterman. The trucks were ridden by Pierre Andre, freestyle legend. Happened to, be available to me. I've kept a regular board. That's an Almost Ren and Stimpy that I had for about a year, but I'm just throwing it in as 2023 because I'm still riding it. So I like to try to mix it up and skate park and like regular skating where my trucks are loose and I can do turns and ollie. Is pretty much all I can do now in terms of normal skating. And then freestyle, I have about 20 freestyle tricks that I practice every day and routines that I practice, kind of like a workout. And that's what my skating life consists of now. Occasionally going to skate parks, but mostly just skating in front of my house. I'm 43 now, and yeah, I think I'm going to keep skating as long as I possibly can. And there'll be many more boards and many more stories to tell. So for anyone who got this far, thank you for watching. And we're going to end it now. Peace.